Hi everyone. In this video, we will be looking at the way plants make energy through photosynthesis. So in general, photosynthesis contrasts with the other type of cellular metabolic pathways like cellular respiration in that it is an endergonic um an endergonic reaction where cellular respiration is exergonic. In photosynthesis, it requires carbon dioxide, reduces it um, to sugar by adding electrons to build up glucose, and cellular respiration oxidizes sugar into carbon dioxide to kind of basically by removing the electrons and um, hydrogen ions to basically break it down into carbon dioxide. So one thing about photosynthesis is that it requires sunlight and organisms that are basically using sunlight to make food are called photoautotrophs. These some examples are like plants, algae, cyanobacteria, and then there are other organisms like chemoautotrophs where they basically capture energy from like different inorganic compounds to make the food. Some examples of these are like thermophilic bacteria. There are like hydrothermal vents at the ocean floor to kind of provide the chemicals that are necessary to support abundant and diverse organisms like these organisms themselves. So for chemoautotrophs, this is an example where this is an example where it's the giant tube worms like these, where they live near the hydrothermal vents that we were talking about. They do not have a mouth or a gut, but they have like a gill-like plume like this, where it captures like hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide, and oxygen gases from the water itself. And then these endosymbiotic hydrogen sulfide eating bacteria live in the organ called troposome and use these gases to basically produce the energy that's required for themselves and the tube worms through chemosynthesis. Now, any animal or like organism that rely on sugars made by the autotrophs for energy needs are referred to as heterotrophs. Basically, the predator eats the deer here, receives the portion of energy that originated from the photosynthetic vegetation that these deers ended up consuming, or like these fungi that are basically taking up their energy needs. Now, when we look at the big picture of photosynthesis, what we see is that the photosynthesis process itself uses solar energy, like sunlight and carbon dioxide and water, to kind of produce the different carbohydrates and sugars that need to be made. And basically, oxygen is generated as a waste product of photosynthesis, and it gets released into the air. Now, within plants, normally the process of photosynthesis occurs in the leaves, in the mesophyll layer of the leaf itself. If you want to look more into the structure of the leaf, check out this cool video here. But particularly, we're going to be focused on the structure called chloroplasts. This is where photosynthesis occurs in in the leaf itself, uh, of like green plants or like other algae or like other photosynthetic organisms. So chloroplasts basically have two membranes, the outer and the inner membrane, like mitochondria. But then it also has a structure called the thylakoids, which are basically connected internal membranes of flatten vesicles, like structures that basically form stacks like these, where it's like a grana, and it basically contains large quantities of certain pigments, and the most common one is chlorophyll. And then there's a region in between, like the thylakoids and the inner membrane, where it's called the stroma. This is just a more uh, uh, zoomed in version of the chloroplast structure itself, and photosynthesis reactions occur within the thylakoid membrane and the stroma itself. Now, one thing about photosynthesis is that it requires two linked sets of reactions. One is the light-dependent reactions, and one is the light-independent reactions. So basically, the first part here kind of occurs in like the thylakoid membrane, like we were talking about, and then the light-independent reactions occur in the stroma itself, the fluid around the thylakoids. So within the light-dependent reactions, what we see is there are two photosystems that allow the production of oxygen from H2, like water hydrolysis, and use the energy from the electrons and protons to basically produce the ATP and the electron carriers that we have. And then with light independent reaction, there is a certain set of reactions, which is called the Calvin cycle. And what happens is in this cycle, we produce basically simple sugars from like carbon dioxide, using the energy from the ATP and the electron carrier that was generated in the light dependent reactions, and go from there in making sugars and all that fun stuff to create more energy. Now, the light dependent reactions occur in the thylakoid membrane itself, and the light independent ones occur in the reaction, like in the stroma itself. And these are just some videos that go more in depth if you guys want to take a look with these reactions. So check them out. That way it gets a bit less confusing if it is confusing. So what happens with these reactions in photosynthesis is that it looks familiar in that it gets coupled together, where one reaction is helping the process of the other one. So in this case, what is happening is that in the light capturing reactions, or the dependent ones, they have the ATP and the electron carrier being produced, and those get used in the Calvin cycle, which is part of the light independent pathway, and it allows it to build glucose, and it allows you to have more chemical energy. But before we can get to all the fun stuff in those different reactions, we need to understand what is exactly light energy. So light energy can just be the energy itself from the sun. It basically emits electromagnetic energy or radiation in the form of photon uh, particles that travel as waves. And these wavelengths for different energy and light, stuff like that, it can be very different. So it does not carry the same amount of energy in each of them. So if you have a shorter wavelength, like violet over here, what happens is that you have more energy. If you have a red wavelength like these guys, you have less energy. So it's like a longer wavelength, meaning you have less energy. If you have a shorter wavelength, it carries more energy throughout. So one thing about these photosynthetic pigments is that they end up absorbing the light. Basically, they could be absorbed, transmitted, or reflected when they hit an object. So like in this case, what we see is all the lights go in, and then we basically reflect out like green or yellow, depending on the color of the leaf, the photopigments that exist. So the photopigments are specifically certain molecules that only absorb a certain wavelength and reflect the other ones that do not um, get absorbed. And the color of the pigment does not indicate which wavelengths are not being used. So if a green leaf looks green, big, basically a green leaf looks green because it's reflecting or transmitting the green light, but it's actually absorbing red and blue light. Now, there are several different classes of pigment in plant leaves. The first few include the chlorophylls, which are primarily chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. These are primary components in the part of photosynthesis, and it basically absorbs red and blue light and reflects and transmits green light. But then we have carotenoids. Those are accessory pigments that allow uh, a light energy to the chloroplast by absorbing blue light and green light, but reflects every other color like yellow, orange, red. That's a couple of the reasons why we have different colors in leaves. And some other ones in plants include like anthocyanins, xanthophylls, betalains, and so on. So the primary role of these carotenoids and other accessory pigments is basically to kind of allow the absorption of light and pass it on to the chlorophylls. That way, if there it gets it extends the range of wavelengths that can basically help photosynthesis to occur and have the free radicals be stabilized and protect the chlorophylls from damage, basically functioning like sunscreen, for example. So now the absorption spectra of the pigments is also correlated with the action spectrum of photosynthesis. So basically, the wavelengths at which these are absorbed by the pigments also occurs with the spectrum of which time points or like wavelengths that photosynthesis can actually occur. Now, the transformation of light energy into chemicals basically just occurs in the thylakoid membranes, where they are further organized into photosystems. So these photosystems are basically a little complex that includes what is called an antenna complex, uh, like these, and then a reaction center where it allows it to kind of get going. And the chlorophylls themselves that are in the antenna complex basically absorbs this light and basically excite the electrons that are transferred towards the reaction center. Sure. And then the photosystems themselves basically function in the light dependent reactions to kind of produce the ATP and NADPH of it, and or the electron carrier. And what we see is that with the photosystem, so there are two reaction centers, photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. The photosystem 2 is actually by splitting as the electrons there are supplied by splitting the water molecules, whereas the sunlight itself excites those electrons and bounce through the complex itself and are transferred to an electron transport chain, which powers the ATP synthesis. And then with photosystem 1, what happens is they are the electrons there are supplied by plastocyanide, which basically transfers the electrons from the photosystem 2 and just takes it from the electrons end up gaining the energy from sunlight, and the process repeats, this time with the NADPH accepting the proton from the electrons for like NAD plus to become NADPH. So now what happens with this is that there is a model called the Z-scheme. This basically links the two photosystems together. And this is basically saying that the photosynthesis can be more efficient when both of these red and far red wavelengths are available, and allowing both photosystems to run in maximum efficiencies or rates. Now, what's happening with this is it takes a step further and goes into photophosphorylation, which is basically capturing the light energy into it by photosystem 2 and basically produce ATP throughout the process, kind of going through the process here. And and then slowly comes back to the idea of chemiosmosis with the flow of protons through the ATP synthase, providing the energy to phosphorylate ADP into ATP. So basically, this is similar to what is seen with like cellular respiration in other cells. Now, where are these photosystems actually located? So for the most part, the cytochrome complex that has been discussed and the photosystem 2 itself is in the thylakoid membranes of the granum. And then photosystem 1 and the ATP synthase that comes with it is more abundant in the thylakoid membranes exterior to that granum. So it's like here whereas the photosystems and the cytochrome complex are more on the membranes themselves. So now we're gonna switch gears into like the light independent reactions. So now that we kind of understood like the light dependent reactions, the ATP and NADPH that is generated in these two photosystems are now uh, used in the making of sugars within the cell itself. And that kind of leads into the light dependent Calvin cycle. So, this basically is the way to produce sugars by reducing carbon dioxide. And it requires the ATP and NADPH produced by the light dependent reactions. So it basically requires three different phases where it starts off with fixation, with reduction, and regeneration. It's basically these components here. The first part is taking ribulose bisphosphate to kind of be broken down into 3 PGAs, or 3-phosphoglycerate, and then go into more of like the reduction from 3 PGA to G3P, which is glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. And then it kind of goes into going back to regenerating this RUBP from the G3P, which kind of gives more energy, takes the energy and forms it again. So it kind of occurs kind of in like that cycle there. And kind of going a step further with these is that like understanding the importance of this enzyme called rubisco. Rubisco is basically the ribulose bisphosphate carboxylase oxygenase, which is basically a carbon dioxide fixing enzyme. It's found in all of the photosynthetic organisms that use the Calvin cycle to fix carbon. It's basically thought to be the most abundant enzyme on Earth, but it's also a very inefficient enzyme because it catalyzes the addition of um, carbon dioxide to the ribulose bisphosphate, and also catalyzes the addition of oxygen to ribulose biphosphate. So it's just like that cycle going on there. Now it has a total of 16 subunits and total of 8 active sites, where the active sites can either interact with carbon dioxide or oxygen. When it's with carbon dioxide during photosynthesis, it kind of goes into like a happy state. But then when it comes in reaction with oxygen during photorespiration, what happens is these components get formed, but there's also another one. When it's processed, it's just using up the ATP, and it's not actually a good thing for the cells themselves. So how do plants actually control the oxygen levels and carbon dioxide levels to favor photosynthesis over photorespiration? So when the concentration of CO2 is low, what happens is that the stomata ends up opening more to kind of allow the diffusion of carbon dioxide to enter in more into the chloroplast. But if the a strong concentration gradient has to be favoring the entry of carbon dioxide, it's actually maintained by the Calvin cycle, which kind of just continuously uses the chloroplast uh, uh, carbon dioxide that's in the chloroplasts themselves. So now plants one thing that they also have to do is they must balance the amount of water they preserve and the CO2 that they deliver. So what they do is the stomata, when they normally open during the day and close at night, what happens is that the carbon dioxide diffuses in, the byproduct of like oxygen diffuses out, and then water itself also diffuses out. But then when it's like hot and dry days, what happens is the leaves end up losing water to evaporation, so they must close their stomata to kind of uh, help them adapt to that scenario itself, uh, to kind of prevent them from dying of dehydration, basically. Now, plants living in different environments kind of use different mechanisms. It depends. And these are different plants. The ones that we primarily focused on with photosynthesis are more on C3 plants, but then there are also C4 plants and CAM plants where they have different processes in how they would go through or which enzymes they use to kind of just like help with water conservation or stuff like that when it comes to the environment itself to preserve themselves in different conditions. Now, there are also some other uh, organisms that actually do um, photosynthesis. So there are some cool videos about like this sea slug that basically does photosynthesis, and there are more other videos about how uh what if we could as humans photosynthesize, what would actually be the benefit there. So check these videos out, enjoy, and that brings us to the end of the photosynthesis uh lecture.